Now, what's even more important or interesting is that our society today requires a minimum energy efficiency to sustain itself. We wouldn't be sitting here, we wouldn't have universities, we wouldn't have hospitals if we didn't have a certain minimum energy efficiency, right? Like, we cannot go back to, like a 2-to-1. In fact, the Romans had 2-to-1. The Romans were the most advanced society prior to the Industrial Revolution. They had a 2-to-1 energy efficiency. Roman cities could only reach a certain size because the energy efficiency didn't allow bigger cities. And only when the Industrial Revolution came, when we developed the power of coal, could we actually do what we do today, start doing what we do today. Now, of course, technology will improve these efficiencies over time, all of them, right? So we're going to develop on all of these to get them better. But if the world were today go 100% wind, solar, and biomass, we would not be sitting here. There would not be enough energy. We would go into energy starvation, and that's what you start to see now in the market. The second environmental fact that we discussed previously is the material input. Remember, we want to also have the least raw material input per energy output. The least tons of materials to produce the energy. And it turns out that nuclear and coal and gas have the highest material efficiency in tons input per energy output. Not about money, not about emissions, it's about just tons, okay? And hydro and solar, wind, biomass have the highest or the lowest efficiency and the highest material input. And then the next is the space requirement. The space requirement is becoming very important. The space required for hydro is much higher than for a coal or gas power plant, right? For hydro, you need to, affect rivers, put large walls up. It takes much more space. And wind, solar, and biomass, naturally, because of the energy density, it's very low energy density, you need to have huge space required. These are also environmental measures. And when you don't believe this material input, this is from the Department of Energy in the US, which just shows the materials in tons per terawatt hour capacity: coal, gas, nuclear, hydro, solar, wind, geothermal. Now, this is a little bit old, the numbers probably changed today, but just gives you a sense that the materials required to put up energy systems make a difference. When you start to capture carbon dioxide from coal and gas, you will what? Reduce the energy efficiency, because it takes energy to capture the carbon dioxide. CCUS reduces the energy efficiency. When you start to produce hydrogen from wind and solar, you do what? You reduce the energy efficiency, because you need to have more energy to produce the hydrogen. Hydrogen doesn't come from the ground. Hydrogen needs to be produced. It needs energy. In fact, you lose 60% of the hydrogen, of the energy producing hydrogen. 60%. And by the way, you would only use excess, unutilized renewables to produce hydrogen. Why? Well, because if I have wind or solar energy coming out of my socket, I charge my Tesla directly first, before I make hydrogen, and then charge my Tesla afterwards. But why would I first produce hydrogen and then charge my Tesla? No, I first charge my Tesla until my Tesla is charged. And only the excess unutilized renewable energy I would use to produce hydrogen. Now, what the world is doing is, in 2019, we're at 1.5 terawatt of wind and solar alone. Now, the pathways are such that within 8 years, we are supposed to build 8.6 terawatt of wind and solar. This comes from BCG, my own company. I used to work there for 7 years. 8.7 terawatt are supposed to be built in the next 8 years of wind and solar. That means we're going to double our existing infrastructure. We're going to double it. Go on top, put the same capacity of wind and solar up, which is actually the least energy efficient because of the space requirement, material input, and all those things. By 2040, we're going to have double again. And by 2050, we're going to put another 7-8 terawatt on top. That is the current pathway we are going. And I am asking, how is this environmentally friendly? When we look at the environmental impact of our energy systems, we have to look at the entire value chain. There's a production of raw materials that we have to consider. There's processing of raw materials that we have to consider. There's transportation of raw materials and products that have to consider. Of course, there's the actual operation, the combustion of materials, whatever we do, the production. And then, of course, there's the recycling. So these are the main steps where we have to consider our environmental impact. Emissions included that, and then there's non-emissions, right? Because environmental is not only emissions, there's many other issues we just discussed, right? And greenhouse gases are some of the emissions, which we have to consider, but then there's many other emissions we have to consider as well. Sulfur oxide, nitrogen oxides, right? Mercury, chlorine, particulate matter, right? All those things, these are all emissions, right? And then there's the non-emissions, the energy return efficiency, the material efficiency, right? The space requirement, the waste requirement, the animal effect on animal and plant life, effect on health and safety. All these issues are environmental issues we have to consider. And what are we doing? The current focus on energy policy is all about operation and combustion only. We are only measuring the CO2 from combustion. Wind and solar have zero CO2. Why? Because during combustion they don't produce CO2. But when you look at the entire value chain, they produce a lot of CO2. Probably still less than coal. Coal produces double the CO2 that gas does. So we're switching from coal to LNG to gas in Asia to try to save the climate or to help to reduce the climate. In fact, when you consider the value chain, when you consider methane, it turns out that coal is better than LNG for the climate. I just wrote a paper on this, it just got published, peer-reviewed, which proves without beyond doubt that actually coal is better for the climate than LNG. This just gives you a sense of that current carbon taxation actually leads to distortion and undesired consequences. Because we are not having a macro view of what is happening worldwide. We're starting to focus on one thing only and only one thing. And if you were to look at everything together, then we can make a positive difference to our life.